It's all a matter of perspectives on Metroidvania Works Episode 11. As we venture further into 1987 on Metroidvania Works, the action RPG genre begins to take shape. What does it mean to be an exploratory platformer? The success of role-playing games in Japan and the desire for arcade-style experiences custom-tailored for play at home instigated an explosion of proto-Metroidvania games on Famicom in 1987. And all of them involve mixing the platformer genre with other modes of gameplay. Our feature title for this episode is one of the most influential genre works ever. A year out from The Legend of Zelda, Nintendo's first sequel to that disk system masterpiece took a completely different tack by approaching the idea of action RPG far more directly. The original Zelda has stood at the intersection of Hydlide and the Tower of Duraga with just a hint of Dragon Slayer, paring down the RPG concept of character stats to the most minimalist form imaginable. Its top-down action visually resembled the combat scenes from Ultima or XANADU, but played out through real-time two-button action. Zelda reduced the number management element of those games to managing your cash and bomb inventory, with the stat boosts provided by better swords and mystic armor rings easing the difficulty of combat, but ultimately hanging outcomes on the player's dexterity and grasp of battle tools. Zelda II is not like that at all. Its gameplay perspective shifts from a top-down view, at least where combat is concerned, to one seemingly inspired by the exploration sequences in XANADU. In fact, Zelda II reverses the workings of XANADU altogether, where that game allowed you to run and jump in a side-scrolling perspective as you explored, with battles set in a top-down overview. Zelda II's exploration plays out through a top-down view, while combat takes the form of side-scrolling action. The idea of this change in perspective is clearly drawn from Dragon Quest, but Zelda II moves even further away from turn-based encounters once you bump into a foe. You enter side-scrolling scenes, which require genuine dexterity and skill. Here you engage with a variety of foes, who face off against Link with ferocious attacks in great numbers. They can crawl, leap, fly, bounce around the room, and attack head-on. The deadliest foes can even go toe-to-toe with Link, challenging him with his own tools, a sword and shield. Zelda II's side-scrolling sequences owe everything to Namco's Dragon Buster, a minor arcade hit from 1984 that made its way to Famicom 1 week before Zelda II hit. Bad timing for Dragon Buster, which paled in comparison to the scope and intricacy of Nintendo's game. But there's no denying the fact that Zelda II would never have turned out the way it did without Namco's work to study. Dragon Buster protagonist Clovis could run and jump, wield a sword, and endure multiple monstrous attacks thanks to his stamina bar. The game essentially set the standard for side-scrolling swordplay action in a platformer perspective, and Zelda II builds on those mechanics even more elaborately than Wing of MADOOLA did. Not only does Link have a life meter here, but his sword skills allow him to attack at two levels, high and low. When not attacking or running, Link holds his shield aloft, which allows him to block enemy sword strikes or projectiles. Link abandons the tools of the first game, bombs and boomerangs, in favor of combat-oriented abilities and mystical non-combat enhancements. He can cast spells that double his defense, allow him to leap extra high, enhance his shield against high-power projectiles, and even transform into a fairy to slip through keyholes. So fundamentally, Zelda II engages with the concept of Metroidvania far more directly than its predecessor. Link's powers enable him both as a warrior and as an explorer. And if his mechanisms aren't quite as elegant as those of Samus Aran, well, that's because Zelda II legitimately is an action RPG. For the first and only time in the Zelda franchise, Link juggles traditional RPG experience points here. Defeating all but the most pitiful enemies yields experience points, and once you hit certain experience thresholds, you're given the opportunity to level up one of 3 stats. Link's stats max out at 8 in each category, so it's not really possible to overlevel for the final stages of the adventure. But really, the EXP system isn't meant to be the baseline of Link's capabilities. Zelda II still retains the heart container mechanic of the first game, adding into the mix magic containers that add additional spellcasting potential. Rather than raising your max stats, leveling up in life and magic simply improves your endurance and your spellcasting efficiency. The only stat without a collectible equivalent is attack, as Link already possesses the mystical Master Sword from the first game, the most powerful sword in Hyrule, and can therefore only improve his own skill wielding such a mighty blade. Link's physical strength isn't the only way in which he enhances his combat prowess. He can also learn a few sword skills from warriors around the land, most notably the downward thrust attack that allows him to stab down while leaping and makes it possible to shatter certain blocks and reach new areas. In short, Zelda II requires players to manage a lot of different factors in battle, and much of the quest revolves around seeking tools that open up new pathways. Hyrule has been greatly expanded here from the land seen in the first game, which now occupies just a tiny corner of the multi-continent world map. Link's progress is gated by barriers and obstructions that can only be passed with specific spells and tools. You need a hammer to smash boulders and fell trees that reveal new paths, a raft to cross bodies of water, the jump spell to pass high cliffs, and so on. The game largely avoids Metroid-style backtracking, with dungeon-by-dungeon progression carried over from the first game and applied to a classic RPG sense of advancing from town to town and learning new information and new skills from the villagers there. You can wander into areas for which you're not yet properly equipped, such as the haunted areas where monsters are invisible until you acquire the Holy Cross item. But otherwise, there are only a few spots where you need to head back to an area you've previously mastered. Zelda II was largely crafted by a different team than the original game, and it shows. It's a very different game than its predecessor, and very different from its sequels. The next entry in the series, A Link to the Past, would revert back to the top-down, EXP freestylings of the original Zelda. You see echoes of the sword combat here in the 3D Zelda titles, but for the most part this was an experiment that Nintendo quickly walked back. Nevertheless, it was a profoundly influential work on others, as we'll see down the roads in games like The Battle of Olympus and Adventure Time. But next time on Metroidvania Works, Nihon Falcom cements its legacy. 2 months after Zelda II, Konami offered up their first real take on the Metroidvania concept, a more refined and coherent effort than Vampire Killer had been. In a lot of ways, though, Goonies II was cut from the same cloth as Vampire Killer. Konami's first Goonies games, both on Famicom and MSX, had involved level-by-level progression, optional power-ups, and the need to explore each self-contained stage by traveling between layers of the level through skull-shaped doors. While the tools collected by protagonist Mikey only aided in exploration once, by allowing you to unlock a shortcut by performing a super jump across a large chasm, it contained all the pieces that would come into focus for the bigger, more ambitious sequel. The Goonies II once again sees Mikey returning to the hideout of the criminal Fratelli family on a quest to rescue his kidnapped friends. There's also a mermaid involved for some reason. But while this journey initially appears to take the same shape as the previous game, with the biggest immediate difference coming in the fact that Mikey now wields a yo-yo as a weapon rather than just kicking mice to death, it soon becomes apparent that the Goonies II takes a very different approach to exploration. While the game world here is again divided into discrete areas, these aren't treated as separate stages. You can wander through the world and return to any point you like, anytime. In fact, that's mandatory, as you often need to backtrack to seeming dead ends once you acquire the tools to unlock the path contained there. Mikey collects gear and tools as in the first game, many of which are identical to those of the original Goonies. A helmet to protect him from falling stalactites, a raincoat to keep him safe from steaming geysers and powerful waterfalls, and of course a pair of high-jumping spring shoes, now mandatory for progression, thanks to a high ledge in a cave across the deadly bridge. However, many of the most crucial tools Mikey wields don't come into play during the action portions of the adventure. Instead, you deploy them in the so-called adventure scenes. If Zelda II draws its inspiration from role-playing games, the Goonies II takes its notes from a related genre, the adventure game. Its adventure sequences are descendants of the text adventure, as seen earlier in ZORK. Of course, the NES and Famicom used a 2-button controller rather than a keyboard for a user interface, the rare and cumbersome Famicom basic keyboard notwithstanding, so this isn't a literal follow-up to ZORK. Rather, the Goonies II looks for inspiration to NX's PORTOPIA RENZOKU SATSUJIN JIKEN, a highly successful 1985 console conversion of a popular computer murder mystery game designed by Yuji Horii and programmed by Koichi Nakamura, the guys whose next project would be Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest's window and menu-based interface was adapted directly from Horii and Nakamura's work on the Famicom conversion of PORTOPIA. In other words, while many of the console action RPGs of the late 80s were looking to Dragon Quest for guidance, Konami went a little further back in time to the game that made Dragon Quest possible. To that end, the Goonies II does not include experience points or character stats. Mikey simply gains an extra point of life every time he rescues a friend, and his attack strength never increases. He can simply choose between one of 3 different weapons as the situation requires. There's also no economy for buying things here either. But you do meet plenty of NPCs who offer you advice and give you important tools for your quest. These encounters all take place in the adventure scenes, which shift the action to a first-person perspective and play out their menu commands and cursors. Mikey can punch walls and don X-ray specs to reveal secrets, smash ceilings and floors with a hammer to open hidden paths, dive into the water with a dive suit, use keys on vaults and prisons to liberate treasures, and Goonies alike. In the finest adventure game tradition, this is a slow-paced hunt-and-search process in which you spend a lot of time trying every tool in your inventory on every available surface. It's not exciting, and it kills the pace, but it's a noble effort all the same. The adventure scenes have been added to this game's in-between spaces. As in the first Goonies, Mikey passes back and forth between the front and back layers of the world to explore. In the original game, that played out as a seamless process where you ducked into a door and appeared in another space. Here you enter a door and need to navigate to the other spaces by making menu selections and potentially revealing a path with tools. It's a little bit clumsy, but it's intriguing, essentially turning the progression loop of Metroid into a menu-based adventure game, or rather, back into a menu-based adventure game. Also notable is the fact that the Goonies II contains an in-game map to help you make sense of the relationships between the front and back scenes. The adventure scene design concept didn't make its way into many other games. Outside of FCI's Dr. Chaos, it was pretty much a non-starter. But it gave Konami another opportunity to kick the tires of the exploratory platformer genre in preparation for eventual greatness. Perhaps more importantly, the Goonies II is one of the few action RPG-type games to draw an overt line back to the Metroidvania's primal roots in the likes of ZORK and Colossal Cave Adventure. A more subtle approach to the action RPG, or maybe just a less confident approach, arrived a few months after Zelda II and the Goonies II, in the form of a game whose exploration of the genre amounted to an unexpected swerve. Tecmo's Rygar began in the arcades as a shameless clone of Rasten's Saga, featuring a beefy barbarian who stiffly ran about the world slashing things up with his bizarre disc armor weapon, a sort of chain flail with a large, shield-like disc at the end rather than a spiked ball. It played out across dozens of stages containing almost no variety from one another save the background wallpaper, an endless, tedious slog of repetition. Rygar on NES was nothing like that. Aside from the hero and his weirdo weapon, as well as the visual motifs of stage backgrounds and enemies, the Nintendo adaptation was essentially a different game altogether. This Rygar abandoned the arcade's driving premise of running left to right along a boring line fighting enemies forever, discarded the notion of a timer and indestructible enemies to serve as an implacable threat once time was up, and became, essentially, Tecmo's own Wing of MADOOLA. Having been released a mere 3 months after Zelda II and 4 after Wing of MADOOLA, Rygar's facelift clearly wasn't inspired directly by those games. Again, it was just something in the air in Japan as Dragon Quest fever took hold and developers looked to games like the Tower of Jiraga and XANADU for inspiration of ways to revitalize arcade games for home release on an aging, underpowered console. Famicom home ports could not compete graphically with powerful arcade machines, so instead they promised meatier, more involving gameplay. Like Zelda II, Rygar also makes use of perspective switching to help distinguish combat from exploration. The through line isn't quite as clear as it was in Zelda II though. Where Link's overhead view presents players with a classic RPG-style abstraction with no conflict and a zoomed-out perspective on the map, Rygar's top-down sequences require players to battle enemies with the same combat mechanics as the side-scrolling bits. It essentially shifts between Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 gameplay, and the top-down sequences are reserved for key moments in the game. Players will spend the most time in an area called Garlaws, which acts as a hub for the bulk of the adventure. Rygar does require a bit of backtracking, most notably you need to return to the opening stages once you acquire some critical tools for exploration in order to explore a robot battlefield in the sky. But rather than forcing you to hoof it through interconnected platforming sequences, you move between these areas by navigating Garlaws. The bulk of side-scrolling sequences in Rygar work a lot like Zelda 2's dungeons, in that you visit them once and really need never return again after you've completed them. Beating an area boss typically rewards the warrior of Argul with a device that aids his navigation of the world. A rope, a hook to use on the rope as a zipline, that sort of thing. And yes, there's an experience system here that allows the warrior to grow in strength and durability. As you destroy enemies, you gain tone and last points, a dual stream of experience. As tone increases, the warrior's attacks grow more powerful. Last grants him additional hit points as it reaches certain thresholds. It's a very opaque experience system, but nevertheless it comes straight from the world of role-playing games. The warrior also gains consumable magic points, Mind, which allow him to cast one of 3 different spells that he knows from the outset of the quest. As an action RPG, Rygar is pretty clumsy compared to Zelda 2. The combat can be glitchy, and making use of your navigational tools, which are designed to deploy automatically, can be very imprecise, especially in the top-down areas. It's also kind of tough to judge your relationship to enemies and projectiles in the top-down scenes, a task made even more ambiguous by the fact that you can jump while in that perspective. Even so, you can't help but admire what Tecmo attempted to do here. They took a boring, bog-standard arcade belt scroller and turned it into a rich, multi-format exploratory platform with RPG mechanics and NPCs to talk to. Rygar doesn't seem to have influenced the design of future games, making it a sort of Metroidvania Galapagos, but it's nifty all the same.